Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our final class of this semester season of A Priest and Rabbi Walk into a Classroom. Today we have, we're going to do in 45, 50 minutes what you could easily spend a whole semester, if not year or life, on, talking about the nature of God and the evolution of that. For those of you that, I know a couple new people here today, we have mined together, priest, rabbi, with all of you, the parables of Jesus. So we've heard from a Jewish perspective, Christian perspective, and today we're going to talk about God together. There's a lot of things we hold in common, and some things are different, and some things come from ancestral roots that way. Before we begin, I do want to point out, shameless name dropping, if you've not seen, the Jewish Chronicle is a weekly publication, print and online, and if you can, we'll make sure we get right up in the camera for this one. On the cover, above the fold, on the cover of Jewish Chronicle is Rabbi Aaron Bisno about the new Center for Interfaith Collaboration that he began just a couple weeks ago, formally launched that here at Calvary Church. Aaron's office right away is right around that corner, but it's a wonderful article about what Aaron's doing in partnership with Calvary and all of us. So great job, Aaron. You'll be signing copies after the class? Great. You could read it online as well. Rabbi, would you please pray?
I'll sign it, then you can wrap your fish in it. We'll close out this season of classes the way we begin each one of them with the blessing over study, and then Jonathon and I want to invite you to engage with us in a conversation about how we understand God and how that understanding has evolved and changed such that we hold the ideas that we hold now. Our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, source of life and inspiration in the universe, who has blessed us by providing us with texts of meaning. Amen. So as John and I were, this is one of the class sessions where we have a topic that comes from outside. We did purity a few weeks ago. This one is about the nature or evolution of the concept of God. As John and I were discussing it earlier this week about how to begin addressing such a large topic in an economy of time, I shared with Jonathan I had been teaching this past semester at Seton Hill, a class on Hebrew Scriptures and a general survey of faith, religion, and society to the students at that campus in Greensburg. And as I gave them the exam this past week, the last question I asked is, what will you take from this class that will allow you to think differently, or what surprised you? Just so I could get some feedback of sort of where they were when they started and what their thoughts are. And I was flabbergasted at how many suggested that they found the course refreshing because the religion that they had been taught as children, or the way in which they'd come to understand religion, was as something tremendously rigid that couldn't be questioned or didn't seemingly ever to have been different than the way they were given to understand it, and they were grateful for just sort of a crack through which they could begin to see some light or begin to expand their understanding of religion such that they don't have to, or they need not dismiss it out of hand, or they can appreciate that there are other ways, other religions, or other valences within our own traditions, respectively, that would allow them to mature in their faith or grow in their understanding of what we mean when we say, or what you mean when you say about God. In a related story, when someone tells me that they don't believe in God, and sometimes they say that sort of sheepishly, and other times they make a bold declaration, but they want me to know that they don't believe in God, invariably my response to them is something along the lines of, I'm quite certain that the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. And that there are lots of ways that God has been understood, or for us to make sense of what that reality might mean for us, but we need not be locked into a particular perspective or a particular definition. The goal of this course this year with regard to the parables and now with regard to the topic of God is to widen our aperture a bit, to expand our willingness to appreciate different valences and understandings that in this way we might come to have an enhanced appreciation of our own beliefs or faith or understandings of religion or faith or theology, and at the same time we make room for allowing for the multiplicity or the variances that exist there. Okay? So we thought that originally this idea about talking about God grew out of a conversation Jonathon and I had about what we mean by monotheism and how that concept has changed. And the two books that I refer to most often when having this type of conversation, one is The Evolution of God by Robert Wright, which talks about actually how the concept of God has evolved from animism, where a given tree has a spirit, or the forest has a spirit, or we're praying to this God or that God, and then recognizing that as we want to engage in more social intercourse and more economic activity with each other, we have a vested interest in identifying those beliefs that we share in common. Right? If we can all focus on what we understand in common, then on that common ground we can begin to build relationships. Whereas if we start from the position about what our differences are, then it's very unlikely that we'll come to find a harmonious way of interacting with each other. So Robert Wright, in his book, The Evolution of God, traces how the concept of God has evolved, and then the incentives as two peoples or two populations with different God concepts or different understandings of the divine, how they begin to find common ground, such that we now have a concept of monotheism that essentially says the following: that everyone in whatever house of worship you may be, the synagogue, the church, and the mosque on the corner, whatever happens inside those buildings, all are speaking about the same God. That's how we understand monotheism today, that there's one God in all of the universe and all of creation, and it's true that different peoples and different traditions speak of and address that God in different ways, but we're all speaking of the same God. That's what we mean today as monotheism. Yes? Right? Such that we're comfortable with a rabbi being in a church, and how can we do that? Well, we have a common God. We just have different ways of describing it, and in that way, we can all grow in understanding or in faith. But in the biblical period, when we say anachronistically that Abraham was the first Jew or the first monotheist, what the Bible is describing is not monotheism as we understand it, but is something quite different, but you'll appreciate the origins. The original idea of the Israelites having a single God in contradistinction to various gods being for different purposes, war and fertility and, fire and crops and the others. The idea of a single God for the Israelites is actually technically known as monolatry. That is a belief in monolatry, the belief in one God among many. And so we have prayers in the Jewish tradition that say, "Who is like you, O God, among the gods that are worshipped?" That's called monolatry. When you have one God, but you recognize you live in a world where many gods are worshipped. Today, our notion of monotheism is quite different. It's not that we say we have, or I have one God, and you worship other gods. We now are saying in a rather paternalistic way, everyone has the same God. Howsoever you understand or imagine God, well, that God is the same God we're speaking about, as long as we're talking about a God that has something to do with love and justice
Ask if they agree with
and peace. Do you agree? Does that make sense so far?
Do you think it's the same God that we're talking about? Do you assume so?
Yes.
Jews, Christians, Muslims?
Yes.
Right? That's how we've come to understand what we mean by monotheism. We make allowances. The problem, of course, arises when anyone, anywhere claims that God told them to kill infidels. Then we have to say, whoa, 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 whoa. No, you misunderstand God. That's not what God wants. God is a God of justice or love or peace or what have you, and you have a misunderstanding, we say about the person who we now brand as a terrorist or a fanatic or something else, because their concept of God doesn't square with the one that we use in order to affirm that we're all in the image of God, or that everyone's a child of God, and the rest. Does that make sense? And Robert Wright, in his work, moves us towards appreciating that we have a vested interest in recognizing that our God is the same as the other God, or more accurately, the other God, howsoever described, is the same one about whom we're speaking, such that we can see in the face of anybody the face of God, or in the image of God. Does that make sense? That's an important piece. The other part I want to share is from a book called God, a Biography, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Jack Miles, where he traces God as a protagonist in the Bible through Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and through the Hebrew prophets, all the way up through the book of Job, which is the last time in the Bible that God communicates orally or with words and speaks to the people. And Jack Miles traces God in Genesis as a creator God. And what follows from that, if there's one God who created all of humanity, well, then that's a God that is a universal God and has created the world, and that becomes God's calling card. And then later in Exodus, for the Jews, God is a liberator and takes the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt and redeems us from slavery to freedom. And then God in Exodus is a lawgiver. And we all sort of conflate those, but Jack Miles in his book does a nice job explaining that the God of Genesis has a certain set of characteristics, and the God of Exodus likewise has a certain set of characteristics. We've conflated all of them, right, such that we're comfortable toggling between Creator God, Lawgiver God, Liberator God, Prince of Peace, Wise Counselor. We keep adding, right, new names or other names or valences to God as it begins to expand and incorporate more and more. The other concept I just want to introduce as we open the conversation is between the tensions within all religions, between what we refer to as particularism and universalism. Particularism are those parts of a religious tradition that speak directly to Christians or to Jews, what's expected of you because you're in this group. So for Jews, the laws of keeping kosher, for instance, are particularistic laws, right? Or the way in which you practice as a Christian is particular to Christians and wouldn't be expected of Jews, for instance. But universal ideas such as everyone's created in the divine image, or everyone should honor their parents, or everyone has access to the kingdom, or what have you, universal ideas are for everyone. And those are in tension also, constantly, because each religion has its own relationship with God, and God has certain expectations of you, given the religious denomination or identity you have, and we're concerned with a much larger locus of concern. So in Christianity, personal salvation, but also recognizing the responsibility we have to the world, and in Judaism, similarly. We have certain things that are only incumbent upon Jews, and Jews are not interested in necessarily others believing as Jews do. This is good for Jews. You have what's good for you. And then there's a universal plane where we're all in the image. We're all sharing something in common. And within those polarities and within those tensions, our understandings of God begin to expand or contract. Can you jump in?
Sure. Let's go way back to the beginning. Well, not all the way back, but you know what I mean. When we say God, what images, ideas does that conjure up for you? What do you think of when we say God? So we all agree, sounds like, that we say God, that's the same one for Muslims, Jews, Christians. What about Baha'i? What about Buddhist? What about, I don't know, pick any religion that comes to mind. Which one? A lot of Hinduism. So, Jessica, even in Hinduism, which at least from the surface looks to be polytheistic, multiple gods, there is one ultimate grounding of being. You could probably say similar things about Buddhism. Buddhists don't believe in God. In fact, most Buddhists do have a pantheon of gods. Some strains of that don't. But generally speaking, most religions have some sense of ultimate ground of being, authority, deity, whatever. And generally speaking, most of us will agree, well, that whatever the ultimate is, that when we talk about that means God. That has absolutely not been the case at all times. That's partly what we want you to begin to think about is the evolution of the idea of what we now call God. So give me, phrase or word, when we say God, what image, word does that conjure up for you, Marlene?
Well, that's what I learned in this course. I don't have an image. I have a feeling of the spirit.
Feeling of a spirit rather than image.
But most people do have some tangible image of a God that is active, that does things. And my feeling is that it's man that does God's will or what we've learned. And as far as the evolution, the little bit I know about other religions, they're all Abrahamic. They call them, I think the Muslims call themselves an Abrahamic.
So the three, what are the three big Abrahamic or descending from Abraham religions?
You know, I was in Russia and I was shocked. We went into a Russian Orthodox church and their icons, the first icon is the slaying of Isaac, of Abraham, and it seems that everything seems to come from that. The fact that Abraham did not, he was willing to obey what he thought when God was speaking to him, and yet God changed his mind.
Yeah.
I was surprised.
So you talk about it being in a Russian Orthodox church and saw an image of Abraham with Isaac. For fun, guess who are the bottom figure on the pulpit? There's statues underneath on the ground level, and then just above that is another one. All the ground level are Hebrew saints, Old Testament Hebrew Bible characters, the basis on which everything else rests. The next layer is Christian saints, and then Aaron Bisno will be standing on top of all that this morning when he preaches. It's quite literally meant to be that way. That's the grounding root. So when we talk about Abrahamic or religions from Abraham, it's three. Judaism, Christianity was after that. Islam is the youngest of the three. All come from that same root. Hinduism, other things would not necessarily. Yeah. Got it. So what other, Aaron mentioned several, Prince of Peace, Judge, Creator. Another way to think about images, what in the world, love, kindness, yeah, those are good. What type of God asks some guy to sacrifice his son? Particularly when you couldn't have any kids forever, and you finally get one and you're supposed to sacrifice him? I don't like that God, frankly. I want God to give me stuff, not take away my most valuable person or thing.
It's a testing God.
It's a testing God. Sonny? Triune God?
Yeah, God
What?
the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I could talk for hours and hours, if not years and years about that. We'll get to it, but that's a Christian image, obviously. Great. What else? Hope.
That's what I think Jesus gave us.
Jesus gave us hope.
We haven't mentioned Judge. You were talking about the procession of different forms of Christian or of God over time, and if you're, Genesis is the creator. Talking about Isaac's story, that's sort of a judge or a tester. Is different plurality of roles that God takes on for us over time.
Yeah. Over time, this gets to a broader thing, that God as judge, there is so many images, particularly if you think of the Bible stories as conveying ideas or characteristics. God as the judge, God as the creator, God, a big one is the redeemer, the one who ransoms Israel, saves it that way. Good point, yep.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, Aaron earlier spoke to the kind of paternalism, the paternalistic undertones that a lot of the images that I, for example, grew up with, not in the Episcopal Church, but, if you want to get really reductive about it, if we're talking about what image does God bring to mind, it's a man on a cloud with a long beard who is like this.
A man on a cloud with a long beard.
Yeah, and then
It's It's a good-looking beard too, right? Not a scraggly thing. All right. ZZ Top style beard. That's exactly what I had thought of myself. Yes, go ahead.
Like the ceiling of the painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel?
Yeah, Sistine Chapel. So because we've encountered so many of those images in Western culture most of our lives, I think one of Aaron's points, because I've had that conversation with, I couldn't count the number of people, I don't really believe in God, tell me about this God you don't believe in. And it's usually that. And then there'll be words attached to that, judging in a negative way. Judging doesn't have to be good or bad, but it's hypercritical of me. Every action, because God watch, is like, you talk about Santa Claus or God. If I've been naughty or nice and is keeping a list and watching me constantly, and that, it's so overbearing. Or patriarchal, which is different than the word you use, but there's that element to it, and it's really removed, distant. Other words that pop up are like transcendent, removed, or immanent, like within us. What else? So I'm pretty sure Aaron and that's, I would say, one of the main, if not the primary image of God of some version. And that's not the God of the Bible, that's Zeus. You think about it? Odin. It's different type of religion there. Who else? Anybody else? Susie?
Well, it seems like human beings create God, not necessarily in our image, but in the essence of what isn't quite right in our existence. We can't really make the world run right.
I will come back to that point because that's what I wanted to talk about. Michael?
Yes, you're on that.
You are why what we now know as a religion comes into being is because of precisely what you're talking about. Michael?
I was struck by the term patriarchal that mentioned, but I think the word that was first used here was paternal, and I think there's a difference between paternal and patriarchal.
I made that distinction, yes.
It's fundamentally an Old Testament God. It might be patriarchal, but I don't think there's much in the Old Testament about God as a father. And that's one of my problems with Christology, the predominance of the father image in Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to try to define my sense of God in Christianity, I think John comes closer to it than anyone else, the notion of the rational principle of the Logos.
Okay, so we talk about Gospel of John introduction.
Anthropomorphic, and one needs to guard against anthropomorphism strongly in a way that I think the Christian doctrine of the Trinity helps us to do.
Yeah, so very good point. Let me suggest, sorry.
Well, I think some of the, I don't want to say dangers of it, is that sometimes God can be perceived as self-serving. And so, like, because we create God in the image of what we want God to feel like, and so that gets a little scary as we talk about, like, interpretations of religion or how you feel in a certain place. But if God is of everything, then we are the ones that are constantly redefining what that image looks like. That's a place where we have to really be guided, perhaps, or directed, or constantly reevaluating how we're perceiving our image of God in time, place, and space.
That's an excellent point. On a different subject, Aaron and I, we had lunch Friday, talked about this. How do you discern the will of God? What is, another way to say it, interesting, in our tradition, we'd say, I was called here. So say I'm discerning, a priest is discerning a call, or what's God's call in your life. Do rabbis think that way?
We don't use that idiom.
We don't use that idiom, no. Doesn't mean they're completely different, but it is striking to me when priests or anyone else pray that we're often called to a higher compensation package. I really prayed about it, and God called me here. And it never seems to be like downwardly mobile. And how often in your life do you pray, Jesus answered my prayer. I got exactly what I wanted. Is that necessarily true? And I don't mean to belittle it, but how does God answer prayer? Or how do we discern? It often seems, clearly this result was God's will. Is it? That's how we voted, doesn't mean it's God's will. God can be used as blessing what I already want to do. And that, I don't think, is consistent with good Christian theology, but that is very often the case what happens. I want to go back, if I could, to Susie's great point. Think back, if you could imagine, so what was the first religion? There's some type of primordial religion that exists in the world. And the best we understand, in those hunter-gatherer type societies, there was no concept like we now think of as religion. That is, in those type of societies, they tended to have of spirits or gods, and it was never just one. There was always a pantheon, and they had certain characteristics. They were God within animals, or some sense of animism. God is in this tree or rock or whatever. And there might be some type of higher-up creator God, but there were ways to deal with the world. And so Susie's point is the same. One thing that's hard for us to conceive, was somebody 12,000 years ago, pre-agriculture, like us or completely different from us? They were a whole lot like us in terms of intellect. Now, they didn't have tools like we do or these other things, health and so on, but they had some of the same basic ideas, communicating, thinking in different languages. And so when it doesn't rain for, 3 months, what's the cause of that? Is it weird, atmospheric conditions? Maybe the God up on the mountain is mad. Or why did this eclipse happen? Or why did she not get pregnant? Or why did we lose this war? You look for explanations. And oftentimes, I would say the reason was they had this, there's no separation of religion. Everything is bound up with one another. So, two big questions. Why do natural phenomena occur? Whatever that good, bad, or however we, affects us is how we interpret that. Or, more broadly, or specifically to humans, why do bad things happen to good people? Is a question that has been asked probably since the first human. I don't deserve this, why me? I mean, that's not terribly different. Sandra?
Well, the first book that I ever read was Why Bad Things Happen to Good People.
He just died, didn't he?
Rabbi Kushner.
Harold Kushner, whose obituary is in today's New York Times.
Oh, really?
Yep.
It's a wonderful book. It explained God and the causes of things. And what I learned was that God neither causes nor prevents tragedies.
Right, so
Or atmospheric conditions.
That would be a contemporary Christian and Jewish perspective. But think back 12,000 years ago, there's not one God, but and gods are not to deal with morality. Like now you think of religion, what does it mean to be a good person? What's a meaningful life? That had almost nothing to do with souls or gods early on. It's trying to understand how the world works and how do we manipulate that or not? How do we manipulate it better?
yes. Can I say a few things? To Susie's comment, I think you're absolutely onto something and shouldn't hedge your ideas. That is to say, while we're told in Genesis that we've been created in God's image, a universalistic message, probably more accurately, we created God in our image. Certainly the anthropomorphisms, how we get to an old man on a cloud, or even God spoke and the world came into being. These are anthropomorphisms, right? And certainly the rabbis in the 1st and 2nd century, contemporaneous with Jesus and the disciples come apostles, posit that God is essentially in their own image of the rabbi par excellence. That is to say, if the rabbis can memorize the Torah and interpret it, we should not forget that God wrote it. And as good as your memory is, God is ahead of you in that way. Or as judicious as you are in your human courts, God is the ultimate judge. That idea, yes?
We even call, we even call Jesus in many places the new Adam. If Adam and Eve are the original, Jesus is the new Adam, like the best possible version of that. Sandra?
So, Aaron, speaking to, we were made in God's image.
Come over here.
When I was at the JCC recently, a friend of mine Jewish, said to me, how arrogant that we would ever think that we were created in God's image. So what do you think of that? What do you make of that?
I think there is a lot of hubris in suggesting that we're in God's image. But what does it mean, or what does it suggest, right? Going back to my original idea, that when I introduced early in the course, that what you believe is interesting, but what your beliefs lead you to do is significant. If we believe that everyone is created in the divine image, or if we live in a world where we allow that to be our operative assumption, whether or not it's true or a fiction or what have you, if we believe that everyone's created in the divine image, then what follows from that, I would suggest, it implies or imports that everyone is unique as God is unique, that everyone is of infinite worth because God is infinite, and that everyone in this regard is also equal. So you're unique and infinite, but so is every other person likewise unique and infinite, and therefore we're all equal. That there's a social compact or contract that flows from that. Is it hubristic? For sure. For sure. Unless you believe that the Torah, the Genesis, the Bible was written by God, in which case it's not we who are asserting it, it's that God has written it as such. But what Judaism teaches is that while we believe that the idea that we're created in the image of God is the greatest teaching in the Torah, that every human being is created in the image of God, the real gift is not to be in the image of God, but to be aware that everyone's in the image of God. Right? The significance of that. You have certain qualities or characteristics, or there's certain numbers that define your internal chemistry, such that you want to get you may or may not be aware of it, but be aware of the need to maintain your health, or to be aware of that you're interacting with other people and that has a dynamic, is the ultimate gift. I want to say one other thing, if I could, Susie. You referenced Harold Kushner's book. The actual title, but it happens all the time, is not why bad things happen, although he gives the answer, is when bad things happen, right? Because bad things happen. What got Harold Kushner going, Rabbi Kushner, is that his son, also named Aaron, developed progeria. Do you know about progeria? It's the rapidly aging disease. And so his young son, when he was an adolescent, began to rapidly age such that you're 80 years old biologically by the time you're 15 or 16, and you waste away. And he was watching this happen to his son, here, this distinguished conservative rabbi, and it challenged his faith in such a way that he wanted not to reject God, but had to re-understand God, which is essentially what we're describing, just stretching it over centuries. And what Harold Kushner posits is that God, who had been understood, at least in his estimation, as omnipotent, able to do anything, yes, which gives rise to the old riddle about whether, if God is omnipotent, all-powerful, is God capable of creating an object so heavy that even God couldn't lift it? If you can do anything, why couldn't you create just a stone? But if you created such a stone that was too heavy to lift, then you wouldn't be omnipotent, right? So the idea is that this is a God that's transcendent, that is not bound by the laws of physics or the human world, the physical world in which we live. And Harold Kushner then came along and suggested that God is limited. God's not able. There are features in life's design that we talk about, bugs and features in applications. It's a feature of life's design that we suffer ill health and we're mortal and life ends and there's suffering, and that's just how it is. And so Harold Kushner posits the idea that God is limited, that for him, God is not omnipotent, able to do everything, but is bounded in certain ways. For many of us, that's a very satisfying idea. Turns out that Harold Kushner is rejected out of hand by the Orthodox Jewish world, which says, what are you suggesting God is limited? That's the antithesis of how we understand God. You simply don't have the intellect or the ken to make sense of the world. But because you're limited in that way, you shouldn't project that limit onto God, say the Orthodox Jews, right? For us, moving from an all-powerful God to a God that means hope is a rather modern notion, right? The idea that God is hope inspires but can't fix things per se, or we can't wish for I'm reminded of the joke, you know? You may have had this experience yourself. The guy is circling Oakland, the Shenley Oval, looking for a parking space, and he can't find it. He's circled now 3 times. He's getting increasingly frustrated, so he makes a prayer to God and says, God, if you'll get me a parking space right next to the Porch Restaurant on Shenley Oval, then I'll do all of the things I'm supposed to do. I'll attend church every week, and I'll give charity to the poor. And just then, a spot opens up, and he says, "Oh, never mind, just found one." You know? So, you good? Right. So it's the kind of God we want. The other thought I would suggest, and this should rattle you just a bit, is we imagine there's a large gap between those of us who profess a faith or have a belief in God and those who define themselves as atheists, who have rejected it. But if we allow that, given all the conceptions of God and gods, plural, over the centuries and over the generations, you have, given a given set of beliefs, you've rejected all of those ideas but one, and the atheist has rejected all of the ideas, including yours. So I share that by inviting us to have just a bit of theological humility with regard to what we understand, respectively, each of us. Not that we share a common understanding, but the notion or understanding or who God is for you today, hopefully, isn't the exact same ideas you had earlier in your life, or perhaps even yesterday, in the same way as we get to know our partners and our children and our parents, people we live with, differently over time. And so too do our understandings of God evolve. Please.
Part of this transition is that the primacy of the relationship moves to notions of love. So if you think of like a Martin Buber, notion that why is God limited? Because to be able to really have a direct relationship based on love has to allow some capacity for choice, which then limits God's determinism or God's omnipotence, because if he determined everything, or God, didn't mean he, she, then that would eradicate that capacity for real interchange of love. So the movement, as God becomes something or a being that the primary relationship is one of love as opposed to something else, it feels like that engenders a sort of more God has constraints because love has preconditions.
So God is limited to the extent that we're limited, right? Absent our limitations, God, in a vacuum, as it were, is unlimited. But the relationship limits it. Yes? Or limits. Great.
Let's say I don't like the idea, and I don't think it fits the classical Christian theology that God is limited, quite frankly. And I'm not arguing with Rabbi Kushner, but it is a very different understanding. But part of that idea that why classical Christianity doesn't go down that road, we do in a way, and that's the incarnation of Jesus. But a second way is because the Christian faith is much more influenced by Greek thought, that is other thought, not just Jewish, which has this idea of perfection is unlimited, all those big omni words, the best, the smartest, the most beautiful, which is not particularly Jewish. And so we have this Jewish culture, and usually the term is Greek or Gentile, everything else in the Roman Empire and before and after merging together and influencing that. So that notion, we want to keep that. So one of the ways we have done that, and this is a gross oversimplification, God, how do we know God? The best way is through a human being. And so God chose to enter the world in a limited way, to be a human being with free will, with all that, but yet is without sin. That's partly how we expressed that idea. By the way, and I expected to talk 20 minutes on this, I'll do Trinitarianism in a few seconds here. Why in the world do we have this idea of the Trinity? I'll say very briefly. No idea. Oh my God, it's so hard. To make it a human thing. In fact, in my opinion, it's more confusing, and we often have the lame excuse, well, it's a mystery. Is it really?
Someone said that was the toughest sermon that you had to give.
On the Trinity Sunday? Yeah, that's when you make the assistant preach, or the rabbi preach. It's coming up, by the way, Aaron, in June.
I'll mark my calendar.
So we inherited from Judaism this, and remember at the very beginning, pretty much every Christian follower of Jesus was a Jew. And if one of the things I hope you've learned with all these parables is like they're so Jewish in the way they're doing it, and Jesus, the rabbi, the teacher, is teaching in that style. And so they inherit from Judaism their belief in God, the Bible. All the New Testament came after this, not too long after, but after. And so the whole concept of God is the Jewish version of that, what we'd call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. But then you've got this experience of Jesus, and you're trying to make sense that he too, Jesus, is divine, that Jesus is God, and then to Michael's point, the whole beginning of the Gospel of John is really different. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the rational ordering principle of the universe, and the Word was with God, and the Word is God, was God. And so if Jesus is also God incarnate, if Jesus is divine, we take this Jewish idea of a Messiah and reimagine it, recapture it in a way, release it. And then what does it mean for Jesus to be God too? And if you read church history, the whole first, say at least 4 centuries, is trying to figure out what that means. The greatest explanation or example, when you're in church today and we say the Nicene Creed, which is from the year 325, we believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. That's it. We got it. Everything, we already know all that stuff. Most of it's about Jesus, trying to figure out what that means, who that is. Jesus is this, is not that. And then the Spirit part comes later, because that's just kind of thrown in a way, because who is Jesus is the big question. And so we develop this idea of the Trinity in response to, we have inherited version or understanding of God, believe Jesus is that, and believe this is how God has self-revealed.
Well, they're both Holy Ghost.
They're both Holy Ghost or spirits. The word spirit is used in the Hebrew Bible roughly 25 times, and in the New Testament 275 times. It's a lot. Very simple, like this is bordering on heresy. Well, that's different ways of understanding God. In old-fashioned will be Father, Son, Spirit. God is not, the Father is not the Son, non-est. It'll be, not the Son is not the Spirit, but going in the middle, God is the Son, God is the Spirit. That's a helpful way. What about 1 + 1 + 1 = 3? That's stupid. 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 still equals 1. Those are classic ways of describing that. Without getting into all the technical Greek and other terms about homoousios and hypostasis, they're trying to use the philosophical, cultural categories they had at the time to make sense of their new reality. And what we keep pressing in different ways, the whole idea of God, of religion, of how we relate to God and one another has evolved from the very earliest hunter-gatherers to this idea, say like in chiefdoms and nation states, there's a multiplicity of gods, but this was my God, I'm a fisherman or a hunter or whatever. And then it develops further into monotheism, which is more or less an invention of the Jews, but it was, you can't invent things until all the groundwork is laid before you, and no matter what it is. And that was the right time and place for that to happen. And that developed significantly. But all along, religion, our idea of God, evolves. And those things, this is a fun history lesson, those areas that it evolves to that we disagree with as a whole, in the church anyway, we call, what's the name for it? Heresy. I have to have a finger point when I say heresy, it seems like. Heresy. Yes. So you can't invent new heresies. All the good ones were taken in the first 4 centuries because Jesus is this. No, he's not. That's heresy. That's modalism. That's Sabellianism. That's Arianism or whatever. And you don't want to be on the wrong side of history, so that's ruled out. Heresy is essentially, this is everything in here, this playing field is good. Outside of that is not good. That's still not our faith. So there's huge room to navigate all of that, but that's not right. So back to the evolution of God. I would suggest, particularly when we talk about, I don't believe in God, Tell me about the God you don't believe in. Imagine if your understanding of science ended in about 3rd grade. And I would suggest that most people in America's understanding of religion ended at that 3rd grade equivalent. I don't mean to be condemnatory or judge, but that's been my observation my whole life. And people really don't have categories because, you don't really want to invest that much time. How much time do you have? You got a mortgage and kids and family and your boss is a jerk and so on and so forth. And so religion, just tell me what I have to believe, Catholic, Jewish, whatever, and go from there. If you invest more time, you start to see, oh my God, the stuff I learned in 3rd grade, that's true, but there's so much beyond that. There's so much depth to it to explain the creation, the world in a way that I never encountered before, and it's so beautiful. And that's what we are hoping you will begin to discover, that there is so much beauty and truth lying just beyond the surface for us to engage in. Aaron?
Yeah, I wanted to say 2 things about how the concepts of God or the God ideas evolve. The first is, in order that we find common ground, we either locate those ideas that we share in common. Everyone's created in the divine image. There's one creator God of all humanity, that idea. Or we expand our understanding to allow for your understanding and your understanding. And the classic verse in Deuteronomy, which Jews refer to as the Shema, which is the first word of the verse. It's considered the watchword of the Jewish faith. In English, which cheats the translation, so I'm going to give you the English translation with which you may be familiar, is Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And it's usually understood as the declaration of monotheism. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one, in contradistinction to all the other gods that are worshipped. But if you look at the Hebrew, what it's really suggesting is the God that's known as El or Elohim and the God that's known as Adonai or Yahweh or Jehovah, right? Such that in some translations we refer to God as God and other times as Lord God. The English is not as clear as is the Hebrew. This declaration in Deuteronomy 6:4, which we know as the watchword of the Jewish faith, is essentially saying to 2 groups or 2 communities, 2 populations, the God you know as El or Elohim is the same God as is the God that you know as Yahweh, right? And so you might imagine you have different gods, but we're moving towards monotheism as we understand it today. The watchword of the Jewish faith is to say, the God you worship in the southern kingdom of Judah and the God you worship in the northern kingdom, you're speaking about the same God. In just the same way as the God we speak about here at Calvary and the God we speak about at Road of Shalom, same God. Don't misunderstand, right? That's a way of expanding to say you're both in this group. Now, when that happens, you believe that God is vengeful and angry, or you believe God is loving and generous. Well, now we have a more complex understanding of God, right? In order that we all can be able to find common purpose, or can build an economy, or can live side by side with each other. And so it's important to appreciate that the evolution of an idea, such as God, doesn't happen linearly and not always predictably, but that the God concepts we hold today, each of us respectively, or the Anglican Communion or Reformed Judaism or however large we want to make that, is a different understanding than was likely in some generation before, if ever so slightly, in order to meet the needs that we have in this generation. Does that make sense? And that's just an important thing. There's an enlightened self-interest about whether or not, we mentioned Hinduism, whether the goal is enlightenment or the goal is peace, or whether the goal is justice or the goal is love. These are all wonderful divine attributes and qualities, and different communities will emphasize different aspects as makes sense for their own polity as well as for the circumstance in which they find themselves. Please.
Where then does the concept of religion versus spirituality come into?
So where does the concept of religion and spirituality come into all this? Let me ask a fun question. What's the ancient Hebrew word, Rabbi, for religion?
It's a trick question. There is no Hebrew word, certainly no biblical word for religion. There was no distinction made between how you live your life and the divide between your secular activities and your religious activities, or how you comport yourself in business and what you do on the Sabbath. Those weren't Those weren't separated. And in point of fact, just historically, because Pittsburgh plays a role in this history, there was a document that was signed on the north side of the city in 1885. It was a foundational document in the establishment of Reformed Judaism. It's called the Pittsburgh Platform. And it was the first time, you can Google it, look it up, Pittsburgh Platform, 1885, signed on the North Shore. It was then the Concordia Club of blessed memory, which at the time was on the North Shore. And it was the first time a Jewish community had articulated that Judaism is a religion, and uses that terminology, not unlike their Protestant and Catholic neighbors have religion. But up until that point, there had been no distinction made between how Jews live their lives and what Judaism has to say about what we now refer to as religion. So I would tell you, the question about spirituality and religion, that beliefs and faith are in the realm of spirituality, and religion is how we get the job done. Now, I came across a phrase really rather recently that I really like, and it says essentially this: people come to church for God, don't give them a religion, it's a poor substitute.
But religion becomes the way, culturally and in community, that we share spirituality, faith. Because it is really, really hard to make everything up on your own. We take a smorgasbord or buffet approach, and you often get the picked over leftovers that not been put out for a while at the Eden Park. It's really gross to do it that way. The idea is to have a new, fresh thing. I want to Aaron's preaching, I have to go in just a moment, but to conclude with the idea of being created in the image of God, if that is what we've been talking about, this idea of God evolves to at least where we are now, it means certain things, that you are created with a purpose and with meaning. And discovering that, I think, becomes part of our human task. It means things like every negative ism, racism, sexism against black people or white people or whatever group, has absolutely no place within Christianity, Judaism. If you are created in the image of God, it means you can't hate somebody simply the way he or she or they or whatever look or present or simply are. It suggests all these things, and religion becomes the way we do that, to live that out. Spirituality, our connection with God and other people, is the energy, the spirit undergirding all of that. Anything else?
Okay.
Before you go,
Yeah, I don't want to make a hard distinction between spirituality and religion.
I was going to say, before you two go, I think we all are very grateful for this wonderful.
Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you.